Hi guys, welcome to this video on Act 1 from Inspector Calls. And in this video we're going to be looking at the next section of the play, in which the inspector arrives and begins to question the characters around their involvement with a girl called Eva Smith. He's there investigating her suicide, and each character from now on in the play is going to have some involvement with her life that led to the point where she killed herself. The main character that the inspector will be questioning is Mr. Birling, and in doing so we're going to see a real contrast between the characters of Mr. Birling and the character of the inspector. Mr. Birling develops the values around capitalism that we've already seen. He shows that he doesn't really care about workers and is most interested in protecting profits. On the other hand, the inspector is there investigating a girl who's killed herself. He is most concerned with her and her life and the lives of workers. In doing so, that whole socialist versus capitalist argument that we talked about in the previous video will be developed through the interactions of Mr. Birling and the inspector. Okay, but before we look at the annotation, let's have a little listen to this part of the scene.
Please, sir, an inspector's called.
An inspector? Well, what kind of inspector?
A police inspector. He says his name's Inspector Gould.
Gould? I don't know him.
He says it's important, sir.
Well, all right, Edna, show him in here. Well, I'm still on the bench. Maybe something about a warrant.
Sure to be. Unless Eric's been up to something. And that would be awkward, wouldn't it?
Here.
That'd be very...
What do you mean?
Only something we were talking about when you were out. A joke, really.
Well, I don't think it's very funny.
What's the matter with you, Eric?
Nothing.
Inspector Gould.
Mr. Birling.
Yes. Well, sit down, Inspector.
Thank you, sir.
You're new, aren't you?
Yes, sir. Only recently transferred.
I thought you must be. I was an alderman and Lord Mayor 2 years ago, and I'm still on the bench, so I know the Brumley police officers pretty well, and I thought I'd never seen you before.
Quite so.
Well, what can I do for you? Some trouble about a warrant?
No, Mr. Birling.
Well, what is it then?
I'd like some information, if you don't mind. 2 hours ago, a young woman died in the infirmary. She'd been taken there this afternoon because she'd swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant. Burnt her insides out, of course.
My God.
Yes, she was in great agony. They did everything they could for her at the infirmary, but she died. Suicide, of course.
Yes, it's a horrible business. But I don't understand why I should come here, Inspector.
I've been round to the room she had, and she'd left a letter there and a sort of a diary. Like a lot of these young women who get into various kinds of trouble, she'd used more than one name, but her original name, her real name, was Eva Smith.
Eva Smith?
Do you remember her, Mr. Birling?
Well, I seem to remember hearing that name, Eva Smith, somewhere. It doesn't convey anything to me.
She was employed in your works at one time.
Oh, that's it, is it? Oh, well, we've several hundred young women there, you know, and they keep changing.
This young woman, Eva Smith, was a bit out of the ordinary. I found this photograph of her in her lodgings. Perhaps, Mr. Birling, you'd remember her from that?
May I see the photograph?
Not just at the moment, sir.
Any particular reason why I shouldn't see it?
There might be.
And the same applies to me, I suppose.
Yes.
I can't imagine what it could be.
Neither can I.
It's the way I like to go to work. One person and one line of inquiry at a time. Otherwise, there's a muddle. I think you remember Eva Smith now, don't you, Mr. Birling?
Yes, I do. She was one of my employees, and then I discharged her.
Is that why she committed suicide?
Now, just keep quiet, Eric, and don't get excited. This girl left us nearly 2 years ago. Let me see, it must have been in early autumn.
Yes, end of September. Year before last.
That's right.
Look here, sir. Wouldn't you rather I was out of this?
Oh, I don't mind your being here, Gerald. And I'm sure you have no objection, have you, Inspector? Perhaps I ought to explain first that this is Mr. Gerald Croft, the son of Sir George Croft, you know. Crofts Limited.
Mr. Gerald Croft, eh?
Yeah, we've been celebrating his engagement to my daughter, Sheila.
Mr. Croft is going to marry Miss Sheila Birling.
I hope so.
And I prefer you stay.
Oh, all right.
Look, there's nothing mysterious about this business. It's a perfectly straightforward case, and as it happened nearly 2 years ago, well, obviously it's nothing whatever to do with the wretched girl's suicide, eh, Inspector?
No, sir. I can't agree with you there.
Why not?
Because what happened to her then may have determined what happened to her afterwards. And what happened to her afterwards may have driven her to suicide. A chain of events.
Still, I can't accept any responsibility. If we were all responsible for everything that happened to everybody we had anything to do with, well, it would be very awkward then, wouldn't it?
Very awkward.
As you were saying, Dad, a man has to look after himself.
Yeah, well, all right, Eric. Now, we needn't go into all that.
Go into what?
Oh, just before you came, I've been giving these young men a little good advice. Now, Inspector, Eva Smith. I remember her quite well now. She was a lively, good-looking girl. Good worker, too. In fact, the foreman there told me he was ready to promote her into what we call a leading operator, head of a small group of girls. But after they came back from their holidays, they were all rather restless, and they suddenly decided to ask for more money. But they were averaging about 22 and 6, neither more nor less than is paid generally in our industry. That they wanted the rates raised so that they could average about 25 shillings a week. Yeah, well, I refused, of course.
Why?
Did you say why?
Yes. Why did you refuse?
Well, Inspector, I don't see that it's any concern of yours how I choose to run my business. Is it now?
It might be, you know.
I don't like your tone.
It's my duty to ask questions.
Well, it's my duty to keep labour costs down, and if I'd agreed to this demand for a new rate, we'd have added about 12% to our labour costs. Does that satisfy you? So, I refused. Said I couldn't consider it. We were paying the usual rates, and if they didn't like those rates, well, they could go and work somewhere else. Well, it's a free country. I told them.
It isn't if you can't go and work somewhere else.
Eric, you hadn't even started in the works when this happened. So, they went on strike. Well, that didn't last long, of course.
Not if it was just after the holidays. They'd be broke, if I know them.
And so was the strike, after a week or two. Pitiful affair. Well, we let them all come back. At the old rates, except the 4 or 5 ringleaders who started the trouble. I went down myself and I told them to clear out. And this girl, Eva Smith, well, she was one of them. She had a lot to say. Far too much. So, she had to go.
He couldn't have done anything else.
He could. He could have kept her on instead of throwing her out. I call it tough luck.
Oh, rubbish. If he don't come down sharply on some of these people, they'd soon be asking for the earth.
They might. But after all, it's better to ask for the earth than to take it.
What did you say your name was, Inspector?
Goole. Goole.
How do you get on with our Chief Constable, Colonel Roberts?
I don't see much of him.
Well, perhaps I ought to warn you that he's an old friend of mine, and that I see him fairly frequently. We play golf together sometimes up at the West Bromley.
I don't play golf.
I didn't suppose you did.
Well, I think it's a damn shame about this girl, Eva Smith. Why shouldn't they try for higher wages? We try for the highest possible prices. I don't see why she should have been sacked just because she'd a bit more spirit than the others. You said yourself she was a good worker. I'd have let her stay.
Unless you brighten your ideas, young man, you'll never be in a position to let anyone stay or tell anybody to go.
What?
It's about time you learnt to face a few responsibilities. That's something this public school and varsity life you've had, but it doesn't seem to teach you.
But we don't need to tell the inspector all about that, do we?
I don't see we need to tell the inspector anything more. In fact, there's nothing I can tell him. I told the girl to clear out, and she went. That's the last I heard of her. Well, what happened to her after that, then? Did she get into trouble? Go on the streets?
No, she didn't exactly go on the streets.
What's this about streets?
Oh, no.
Oh, sorry. I didn't know we had company. Mummy sent me in to ask you why you didn't come along to the drawing room.
Well, we should be along in a minute now, just finishing.
I'm afraid not.
Well, there's nothing else, you know. I've just told you that.
What's all this about?
Nothing to do with you, Sheila. Run along.
No. Wait a minute, Miss Birling.
Now, look here, Inspector. I consider this uncalled for and officious. I've half a mind to report you. I've told you all I know, and there isn't the slightest reason why my daughter should be dragged into this unpleasant business.
Okay, so let's start looking through some of this annotation. And as I said before, one of the key things to take away from this part of the Act is the difference between Mr. Birling and the Inspector. So consider how the values they express are different. Think about how the way that they talk is different. And I mean, I think there is even something to be said about the way that they look and about the difference in that. So let's begin. So we're introduced to Inspector Gould. Now there is something to be said for the symbolism around his name, Ghoul being a supernatural force. We'll see more of that come in as we get towards the end of the play, but just bear in mind, this inspector, he kind of appears to exist outside of the normal world. He seems to be able to reach into the very souls of the Birlings and pull out information with very little coercion. As well, you know, there is a big reveal at the end, but we'll get to that when we get there. We then see this change in lighting. You know, I talked about this in the very first video. The lighting on the set begins off pink and soft, and then at this point in the play, it changes to hard white light. And remember I mentioned that staging change, that represents, you know, an interrogation. It becomes much more serious. We then have Eric foreshadowing a little bit of guilt. He's responding to Gerald and Birling, and he seems uneasy and somewhat defiant. The arrival of the inspector has definitely unsettled Eric, and that foreshadows that he's going to have some sort of guilt regarding the reason that the inspector is there. We then have a description of the inspector, and this is an instruction to the people producing the play as to what Priestley saw the inspector looking like. He's described as that he should have the impression of massiveness, solidity and purposefulness, that he should be dressed in a plain darkish suit of the period. Think how that contrasts the shirt and dress suits that all the other men are wearing and the fancy dresses that the women are wearing. You know, there could definitely be a contrast between wearing just a plain professional suit and evening finery. And think about what that might represent if we're looking at that capitalist, socialist perspective for the play. And this, he has a disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking. And this is, again, this is an interrogation technique, that he is giving them time to talk. He's trying to give them enough rope to hang themselves. We'll look at that idiom later on. All of this leads to an imposing, serious view of the inspector, and it shows that he's not to be manipulated. You know, he is a firm man who won't be messed around. We then see the inspector as being incredibly professional. He refers to Mr. Birling as Sir. He won't take a drink. You know, he's saying that he's on duty, so he won't have a drink of whiskey. Then Inspector Birling tries to use the values of the patriarchy to impress and influence the inspector. He makes him aware that he was Lord Mayor and an alderman, that he is still on the bench, to mean that he has been selected as a judge or magistrate within the local area. So he's trying to use these legal connections to show the inspector, you know, I'm a well-respected person within this community. You need to take me seriously. However, we will see the inspector using relatively few words at the beginning of this interrogation, just, like I say, to try and give the Birlings enough time to talk themselves into trouble. So then the inspector starts to go through some of the details of the case that he's there to investigate. And he talks about how he's here to investigate a young girl who's committed suicide by drinking a large amount of strong disinfectant. He says that it burnt her inside out, of course. And this particularly gruesome method of suicide would help to develop sympathy between the audience and Eva Smith. Because to kill yourself in such a horrible, horrible way, you must be living a really, really terrible life. Or there must be some sort of awful trauma that you have experienced. And Eric reflects this sympathy through his involuntary reaction of, my God. And note the difference between Eric and Birling's reaction to the news. So Eric involuntarily comes out with, "My God," he's really, really shocked. Birling, on the other hand, rather impatiently, says, "Yes, yes, horrible business, but I don't understand why you should come here, Inspector." So Eric couldn't control his reaction, but Birling, he doesn't seem to have a reaction at all. In fact, he seems rather annoyed that he's being asked any questions about this case whatsoever. He shows he doesn't really care. He says, "Yes, yes, horrible business, but I don't understand why you should come here." He doesn't see why the inspector is questioning him at all, why the inspector should be there. Now, a note on the name of the girl, Eva Smith. There is some symbolism behind this that will be reflected at the end of the play. Now, Eva Smith was a very common name, meaning that she represents lots of different women. Lots of women that were experiencing poverty, lots of women in low-paid jobs, lots of women that work the streets. All of the things that happen around Eva Smith's life are a reflection of the life experience of lots and lots of women at the time when the play is set, and somewhat at the time when the play was written. In doing so, Priestley is making a comment on society and on how the rich treat the poor in general. The Birlings represent wealth. Eva Smith represents poverty. We then have more evidence of Mr. Birling not caring about the situation. He says, "And I don't see where I come into this." There is no care there. There is no sympathy whatsoever for Eva Smith. And consider what you might say differently in this situation. Consider what Mr. Birling could say differently. He doesn't say, "How can I help?" That would be the normal reaction if a police inspector came to your house saying, "I'm here to investigate a suicide." How can I help? How can I assist? But he doesn't want to help and he doesn't want to assist because he just doesn't care. We then have further evidence for the inspector's interrogation methods, dealing with them one at a time. He takes a photograph out of Eva Smith and shows it to Mr. Birling, but he doesn't show it to Gerald or Eric. Now, in not showing it to Gerald or Eric, he removes from them the opportunity to think up excuses about what they might have done, to maybe even try to get away so that they're not interrogated in the first place. So by keeping every other character in the dark, he means that their initial reaction is going to be their most honest reaction. When Eric asks if the same applies to him, if the inspector is there to question him, the inspector says yes, implying that they are all connected to Eva Smith's death. And when discussing his methods for interrogation, he says that he wants to work one person and one line of inquiry at a time, otherwise there's a muddle. Now this mirrors the structure of the play. We're going to see each character questioned and their stories revealed one at a time with very little crossover. And in doing this gives each character their moment. It gives each character their moment to confess, in a way. And in confessing, try to gain some sort of guilt and remorse for what they have done. Because really that's what the inspector is looking for. Later on he says, "If you go easy with me, I'll go easy with you." He wants them to be aware that what they've done is wrong, but he also wants them to realise that what they've done is wrong. And by separating each story out individually, he gives them time to do this. Otherwise, they're just going to make excuses for each other. They're going to try and persuade each other that what they did wasn't wrong, and no one will grow or learn from this experience. It's interesting to note that Mr. Birling at the beginning initially agrees. He says that it is sensible, really, that he agrees that this is a good way to do interrogation. That will change. We then find details about Eva Smith and that Mr. Birling fired her from his factory because she wanted more money. She kind of formed a union and they asked for more wages. Birling then continues to try to impress the inspector with status, making him aware that Gerald Croft is the son of Sir George and Lady Croft. And he further tries to impress the inspector by showing that Sheila is going to be marrying Gerald Croft. On hearing that the inspector thinks that Gerald needs to stay because he's marrying Sheila, Mr. Birling gets a little bit heated. He says, "Look, there's nothing mysterious or scandalous about this business, at least not so far as I'm concerned. And these broken sentences, these pauses within the words, they could represent shock, fear, outrage, anger. It's that Birling is finding it difficult to control himself. Note the repetition of the word scandal in the form of scandalous. This is Priestley just embedding the idea that what is going on is quite scandalous and what is going to be revealed is a scandal. Mr. Birling then shows that he doesn't understand cause and effect, or at least he doesn't believe in cause and effect. He doesn't see how something that happened more than 18 months ago could result in someone killing themselves. He doesn't see the consequences of his actions impacting on people in the future. However, the inspector, no sir, I can't agree with you there, because what happened to her then may have determined what happened to her afterwards. He describes this as a chain of events, and certainly her dismissal from Mr. Birling at the factory was the beginning of this chain of events. And we're going to track the life of Eva Smith as we go across this play and think about how she started off in a relatively reasonable position and ended up in a truly awful position. He then makes a comment on social responsibility, and this is another key quotation. You take from this what you will. He says, if we were all responsible for everything that happened to everybody we'd had anything to do with, it would be very awkward, wouldn't it? Now, this is the opposite of social responsibility. It's the opposite of the idea that we should be responsible for everyone, that we should be responsible for people that we haven't even met, It's the idea that in society, everybody should be responsible for the protection of everybody else. That's the definition of society. We all live together, work together, and help each other. Mr. Birling's saying the opposite. He's saying that if we lived life like that, it would be very awkward, showing that he has this conflict between caring for people and what would be considered social norms, not just helping everybody all the time, particularly during the early 20th century. Then Eric agrees at this point. He says, by Jove, yes. And as you were saying, Dad, a man has to look after himself. So at this point, he's agreeing this will change. Then Birling, quite embarrassed, says, yes, well, we needn't go into all of that. But this shows a certain amount of paranoia that he doesn't want the inspector to find out what he was saying. He doesn't want the inspector to find out that he was basically saying, community's nonsense, we shouldn't be looking after each other. And I believe on some level, he knows what he's saying is wrong. He won't stand by his words. So that shows that when those words are held up to the world, he knows that what he's saying is unreasonable. And he tries to deflect it by just calling it a little good advice. We then have some description of Eva Smith and her life. He describes it as a lively, good-looking girl. He talks about how she was a good worker, showing that she was good at her job. So good at her job, in fact, that he was going to promote her to head of a small group of girls. So good that she was beginning to progress within this workforce. This is the best life that we're going to see Eva Smith living, really. They went on holiday, and when they came back, they decided to ask for more money. This is the idea of prices versus costs. That's a key quotation for Eva Smith and Birling's involvement in her life. She wanted more money, and Birling, as he's already said, wants lower costs and higher prices. He wants to pay his staff less and charge the customers more. Now, think about this in terms of Marxism. We talked a little bit about that means of production. This shows that what Eva Smith wanted was an even share of the means of production. She believed that the workforce needed to be paid a more fair rate, because at the end of the day, all the money that Birling is making is money being made off of their backs. It's money being made off of their labour. So they wanted a bigger share of that money. That's kind of one of the core principles of Marxism. And of course, by looking at it through that Marxist perspective, that leads us to a conflict between employer and employee over the means of production, which leads to the exploitation of the worker as they have no power. Okay, this is the idea that the person that is in control of the means of production, the person that's in control of the profits, the factory owner, is able to exploit the worker, because at the end of the day, if the worker does something that the employer doesn't like, they could just get rid of the worker. And that's exactly what they do with Eva Smith. We then have some nice parallelism between the inspector and Mr. Birling, showing a very key difference between their characters. When discussing the questioning, the inspector says, "It's my duty to ask questions." Birling replies, "It's my duty to keep labour costs down." This parallelism, when I say parallelism, I'm talking about using the same grammatical structures within what they're saying. So "it's my duty to" and "it's my duty to," they are the parallel phrases, but they show a contrast. The inspector is there to ask questions. Now that can apply to the Birlings in this instant, but at the same time, it could apply to life as a whole. If you are questioning life, then you are questioning the systems that are governing your life. You're questioning the things that are happening around you. Now, at this point in history, what was happening was rampant capitalism and exploitation of the workers. If he's questioning rampant capitalism and exploitation of the workers, then that shows that he's willing to change those systems, that he's willing to try to fight for something that is new and helps more people. However, Birling says it's my duty to keep labour costs down. So for Birling, it's his duty to make sure that those capitalist systems remain in place for the gratification of the owners and the super rich. That is what Birling's all about. It's his duty to exploit the workers that the inspector is trying to protect by asking those questions. Birling then shows that he cares more about numbers than lives. He talks about that it would add 12% to his labour costs, not thinking about the benefit that a wage increase would have to his workers. And then Eric starts to change a little bit. He starts to agree with the inspector. He says, in response to his father saying, they can go work somewhere else, it's a free country, I told them. He says it isn't if you can't go and work somewhere else. He's saying that it isn't like it's a free country if there is no other opportunities. That she's going to really struggle if she gets released. Then we have, again, I've put dramatic irony, but it's probably dramatic foreshadowing. So Gerald here, in response to Birling talking about these girls going on strike, that not if it was just after the holidays, they'd be all broke if I know them. Now Gerald does know them, and this kind of mirrors the circumstances in which Gerald is involved with Eva's life. I will get to that, but just bear that in mind. Birling then talks about his attitude towards women. He said that she had started the trouble, so he sees her as trouble and her actions as trouble. He also says she'd had a lot to say, far too much, so she had to go. This is the idea that Birling won't hire a woman who speaks her mind. He doesn't want someone that's going to challenge him and question his business practices. He also doesn't want someone that's going to campaign for workers' rights. He does not care about workers' rights. And again, contrast with Eric and Birling, Eric says, I call it tough luck. He believes that Eva Smith has been treated unfairly and that the life circumstances for Eva have not been good. At the same time, is this a comment on the nature of capitalism? That it's tough luck. If you get fired, tough luck. Like, it's just the nature of business. Birling then talks about punishing these girls who are asking for more money. He says if you don't come down sharply on some of these people, they'd soon be asking for the earth. Now, this is another key quotation. They'd soon be asking for the earth. This is how Birling feels about people asking for 12%. 12%. It's really not very much. This is hyperbole, over-exaggeration, to try to justify the firing of Eva Smith. Now we have another piece of parallelism here. The inspector uses Birling's words against him in the way that Birling uses the inspector's words against him. He says, but after all, it's better to ask for the earth than to take it. He's saying here that Eva Smith is asking for more money from Mr. Birling, whereas every single week Mr. Birling is taking money from Eva Smith and the other girls. We then see Birling trying to use his influence, status and ideas around the patriarchy to threaten and intimidate the inspector. He mentions that he's friends with the Chief Constable, Colonel Roberts, and that I ought to warn you that he's an old friend of mine. He's trying to show the inspector that he has influence and that he can get powerful people to argue his case for him. He then talks about how they play golf together sometimes up at West Brumley. Now, golf in itself could be seen as a symbol of the patriarchy. Once more, just covering that idea, the patriarchy is the hierarchy of powerful men that control the country, women, but also weaker men, And golf can be seen as a symbol of the patriarchy because it is men only. Golf clubs at this time were men only. Women weren't allowed to play. Most of the men that were in there were from the upper classes, so upper middle to actual upper classes. It's an exclusive club. Golf clubs are places where you have to be a member, you have to be recommended to the club, so it's a very exclusive place. And it's also a place where very powerful men would go to meet and make deals and discuss things that would shape other people's lives. So definitely golf could be seen as a symbol of the patriarchy. And how does the inspector respond to the statement, "We play golf together sometimes"? He says, "I don't play golf." This shows that the inspector is not part of the patriarchy. It shows that he is not connected with that world of exclusivity and upper class and no women and all that kind of stuff. I think that's a really important statement for the inspector. It's kind of a big rejection of everything that Birling stands for. We then have Eric kind of siding even more with the inspector. He bursts out, "Well, I think it's a damn shame." Showing that Eric is starting to be aware of things around fairness. He says, "Why shouldn't they try for higher wages? We try for the highest possible prices." This shows Eric's sympathy with Eva Smith and with the girls that would be in the same position as Eva Smith. And in contrast to Birling, he says, "I'd have let her stay." He recognises that she was good at her job and that it's more beneficial to keep a good worker than to fire someone through an ideological difference. Ironically here, Birling tries to lecture Eric on responsibilities, saying that his public school varsity life, so this going out partying, drinking, having fun life, doesn't teach him responsibilities. Now the irony here is that Birling won't accept his responsibilities, that his lifestyle has led him to reject any idea that he has a responsibility to people in wider society. In response to Mr. Birling picking on Eric for his lifestyle, Eric becomes sulky. He says, "Well, we don't need to tell the inspector all about that, do we?" Showing that there is some sort of secret and shame within Eric. That there's something that has happened within his life that he feels quite shameful over. Birling again backs up the idea that he feels no responsibility for Eva Smith's death. He says, "In fact, there's nothing I can tell him." So he thinks that he's told him all he needs to know, and that's it. He's done. Just to clarify, to go on the streets, that means to enter into prostitution. Then Sheila comes in, and she stumbles into the scene, kind of using her same childish manner, using mummy once more, that childlike word that, bear in mind, we're going to see change across the play. Birling says, "Just finishing." He's going to be out of it in a second. He's just finishing. It's over. This is another example of how Birling is always wrong. This is far from over. There are still a load of characters that need to be interrogated. We've not yet got to the point where Eva Smith has actually killed herself. So there's still a long, long way to go. And the inspector contrasts that just finishing statement with, "I'm afraid not. I'm afraid not." This is Gould controlling the situation, And in this way, we need to think about Gould's character. Interestingly, Gould is and isn't the system. He is the system because he represents the police. He does have an official reason to be there, so they can't just throw him out. He's a police officer. But at the same time, he's outside the system. He doesn't adhere to the values that the system actually has. I would say at this time, most police officers would be somewhat corrupt and wouldn't necessarily interrogate the Birlings in the way that Inspector Gould is. Most police officers would be intimidated by their status and by their power, but Inspector Gould is not, showing that he is outside the system as well. Yeah. Again, Mr. Birling is wrong. He says that it's nothing to do with you, Sheila. He's wrong. Sheila does have a part to play. And then finally, he threatens the inspector. He says, I've half a mind to report you. I've told you all I know, and it doesn't seem to be very important. Now, this is him not seeing the impact of his actions as serious. He doesn't see how what he did to Eva Smith is an issue. But at the same time, it shows his attitude towards workers. He's not showed any sadness or concern over Eva Smith's death. He's not shown any sadness or concern over Eva Smith's death. Quite the opposite, actually. He's just angry that his evening has been interrupted. And I think that shows a lot about the character of Birling. Okay, so that's it for that one. I hope you found it interesting, and I'll speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.